I call the Honourable Member Michael Woodhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's my pleasure to take a call on the third reading of the Education Freedom of Association Amendment Bill. This is the first time I have spoken on this bill in this House, but of course I've followed the debate quite closely, given how important it is to students in Dunedin. And I've actually asked to speak in the third reading, given the calls to me by NZUSA to cross the floor and to vote against this bill on the basis of some comments apparently made by me and reported today. So I want to give my thanks to my colleague Colin King for subbing out and allowing me to make a contribution and to clarify my position. I want to begin by addressing that call. There isn't a hope in Hades of me crossing the floor and voting for this bill. I support this bill completely. No whipping, no shoehorning into voting for it. I said so last year, I said so earlier this year, including in an op-ed piece in the Otago Daily Times, and I'll say it again. I support this bill, and no amount of clever video editing by Labour apparatchiks or ranty press releases from NZUSA will change that. The video clip omitted my introductory support for VSM, it missed bits in the middle, it didn't add text to the top of the video when I was clearly saying things that didn't suit the Labour view. But there are a couple of things that do require clarification. And the first is my statement that it was highly unlikely that the bill would pass in this term of Parliament. And I did say that to Logan and Edgar at the Otago University Students' Association and to David Doe of NZUSA. It's, however, complete nonsense to conclude from those comments, as Mr Edgar did, that this was a verbal assurance of national support to defer the bill until after the election. And if one was to ask any member of this House, including Heather Roy, I suspect, whether or not they thought this bill would pass this term of Parliament, they would all have said that that was extremely unlikely. And the reason for that, Mr Speaker, was the outrageous filibustering by the Labour Party on a Royal Society bill at a cost of nearly $500,000 per hour. $500,000 per hour, Mr Speaker. Members' Day has been debased by that party and they should hang their heads in shame. This is a day for members' bills, not that Labour has any, and it's an absolute shame that this day means so little to that party. So the crocodile tears Labour shed for the passage of this bill are in large part because they were simply outthought by Mrs Roy. And the second clarification is in relation to comments I made about whether the bill could be improved. And earlier this year, I did say that had the bill been introduced in my name, I think it would have looked a little bit different, albeit that the thrust of the bill wouldn't have changed. At that time, I thought a form of life membership should be considered. I thought opt-out was worth considering and indeed was touched on by the Select Committee, with not joining requiring no explanation. One or two other ideas I had not material to the bill, but I wasn't on the Select Committee, so I kept in touch with my colleagues who were informing me of progress in that respect. But here's what I understand also to have occurred. The NZUSA was approached by members of that association, that is student presidents, in 2010, supportive of a compromise position, and recommended that they be put into the NZUSA submission. The NZUSA refused to consider that compromise. They remained defiant against the bill in any form and buried their heads in the sand, pretending the bill would go away. Well, it didn't go away, and the offer of compromise recently made was a desperate attempt to remedy things when it realised the bill was likely to pass. Too little, too late, Mr Speaker, and it should have considered what its association members were saying, some of them at least, more carefully when they were talked to last year. But here's the kicker for me. At the same time NZUSA were railing against voluntary student membership, they were fighting a rearguard action against some of their own membership who were threatening to resign. OUSA and OPSA, I understand, both served notice of their intention to resign from NZUSA. OUSA said as much in its written submission on the bill. So it's strongly opposed to choice for students, but its own constitution enables its own members the choice of membership. And now that's a double standard if ever there was one, Mr. Speaker. And it still hasn't been explained, despite Mr. Peachey further asking for it, how compulsion encourages choice. The rates analogy is flawed. The rates are the equivalent of student fees. If I choose to go to a university, the cost is the student fees. If I choose to own a house in a city, the cost is the rates. So the question not answered by anti-VSM proponents is this: if student associations are so important, if they represent such good value for money, why the morbid fear that students will take flight when association membership is made optional? The students are labelled, our brightest young and our future leaders, are labelled as lacking the simple skill of deciding for themselves whether joining an association is appropriate for them. And if they do, associations should be more worried about why it is that students see such low value in membership than on maintaining compulsion. Because at the end of the day, this comes down to a simple principle of freedom of association. No New Zealander should be compelled to join an organisation of this nature against their will. On this principle alone, Mr. Speaker, I support the change to voluntary student memberships. Now, I also want to just touch on a couple of the comments that I made in respect on that op-ed piece in the ODT, in respect of some of the reasons why people don't want to be members of the students' associations, and one of them was high-profile financial misappropriations by student association executive members. And I don't need to relitigate them, although I did hear Mrs. Roy talk about them in earlier speeches. But the fact is the accountability mechanisms on student associations are not strong enough for there to be compulsion. And I think regardless of what happens in the future, whether Labour do get an opportunity to repeal this or whether this does stay, there has to be greater accountability mechanisms built in to student association constitutions. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, I think this comes down to the question of freedom. And I post a political quote of the day on my Facebook page. My Facebook friends will be familiar with it, but anybody else who wants to read them, other Facebook users, can friend me and read it and other daily updates. Never let a chance go by. Today's quote, thanks very much. Today's quote is from the 14th century poet Dante, and it reads, I quote, "Mankind is at its best when it is most free. This will be clear if we grasp the principle of liberty. We must recall that the basic principle of liberty is freedom of choice, which saying many have on their lips, but few on their minds," end quote. I can't really articulate it any better than that, Mr. Speaker. Freedom is actually a scary concept for some. And we've heard from members of this House who are worried and that they want to hold on to compulsion, much like a drunk holds on to a lamppost. But it is time, I think, Mr. Speaker, to treat our university students like the adults that they are. We ask them to vote. We ask them to fight and die. We allow them certain other freedoms. Well, I think they should have the freedom to choose whether or not to be members of their student associations, Mr. Speaker. I support freedom. I support VSM. I very strongly support this bill, and I commend it to the House.
Order. In accordance with the determinations of the Business Committee, I call on the Honourable Mita Ridanui to make his valedictory